Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you're up this week.
Yes, sir.
What are you bringing to the table today?
All right, folks. I have brought an incredible piece from the one and only Angela Davis to the table for us to talk about today. It's a piece that she wrote for the latest edition of Hammer and Hope. Their entire issue is focused on what's been happening over in Israel and Palestine and the genocide of Palestinians that's been taking place for months now. And so this edition of their online magazine is their response and analysis and call to action about that. The piece we read is called Angela Davis Standing with Palestinians. And it is a brilliant reflection by her on the past 60 plus years of the state of Israel and Palestine's relationship with one another and the globe, as well as a lot of the movement and organizing work that's been done to fight for peace in that region and to fight for justice for Palestinians. And I think because she's Angela Davis and she's so brilliant, she also provides some important analysis around the context and connections that exist between the organizing work that's taken place here in the United States and in other countries around the world for racial and social justice and the work to demand justice for Palestinians, which, I think is so important for us to recognize and understand as we continue to engage in this work and make sense of why this work is so deeply personal for so many of us, and certainly the fact that it's necessary for our collective liberation. So I loved everything about this piece, and I have just been itching for this moment to get to sit and chat with you about it. So let's do it. Where do you want to start, my friend?
Yeah, I love this. I thought it was a great piece to learn from.
Yeah.
I really appreciated the ways that, as you said, she weaved together Palestinian solidarity with other liberation movements.
Yes.
And she says early on in the piece, quote, "Some might say that the issues driving the George Floyd mobilizations and the current protests against the war on Gaza are different, but are they?" Which I think is such a great thing to consider because they're not that different. We've talked about that a few times on the podcast. They're interwoven struggles of freedom from state violence and repression.
Yes.
Some from within the state and some in an occupation manner.
Yes.
So she talked about how the militarization of the police in the U.S. is tied to global militarization in places like Israel. She mentioned how moved she was to receive a letter from Palestinian political prisoners when she was a political prisoner herself in the 70s, and how much that moment and the organizing around freeing her is connected to the cultural and legal control that empires like the U.S. and Israel have been trying to exert over the realities of who gets to be considered human and who gets to be exploited, and the gradations between those two ends of a binary.
Yeah.
Or ends of a spectrum. Ends of a spectrum.
Absolutely. Yeah. I loved her analysis there and that simple question, but are they? Are they different? And she's absolutely right, they're not. And that stuck out to me too. I appreciated her analysis of the organizing that we've seen over the past few years here in the States, and particularly, as you say, the interconnectedness of our struggles and our fights for justice and collective liberation. So I pulled another piece of that I wanted to share because, again, everything that she said in this was just so brilliant. She said, quote, "The collective mourning elicited by the racist violence that claimed the lives of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others galvanized demonstrations aimed at the systems, structures, and histories that enabled such racist state violence. And those demonstrations were implicitly directed at the global imperialism that furthers the proliferation of racial capitalist strategies. Some of the protests also highlighted the lessons the U.S. has learned as a direct result of its close alliance with Israel, which has included trainings offered by the Israel Defense Forces to U.S. police departments all over the country. Whether or not the Minnesota police ever directly learned combat moves from the IDF, the increased militarization of policing here is directly related to global capitalism, including the economic and military ties between Israel and the United States." And there's so much in there that we could talk about, so much in that analysis that I think is so spot on. But one of the things, the biggest thing that stood out to me, and we've talked about this before, is that we are all over policed and in every corner of the globe. And our police and our military here in the United States shares its trainings and its weaponry and tactics and surveillance, all of these things with the Israeli Defense Forces. And it brought me back to us reading that great book from Anthony Lowenstein back in January. And we learned so much about what is happening behind the scenes as it relates to this. And so to me, that violence from this over-policing and militarization is a connection point in our struggles.
Yeah.
That pushes me to want to be invested in the movement and organizing work around fighting for justice for Palestinians, because it is absolutely connected to our fight here, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she talks about that in a lot of different ways. And it made me think of the Anthony Lowenstein book as well, because he has that whole chapter about the connection of United States police departments with the IDF and the way that they sell their so-called expertise at really occupation as something to be looked up to at police departments here, which also
modeled,
communicates something else about how police departments here think of themselves.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Right. So let's go learn from this occupying army about how we can occupy our towns appropriately.
That's right.
Appropriately according to their logic. Yeah. So one of the things that Dr. Davis talks about here is West Germany in the 60s. She says, quote, "A few days before the outbreak of the 1967 war, the police killed a student named Benno Onesorg while he attended an SDS protest against the Shah of Iran's visit to Berlin. Fascist police violence happened at the same time as the Israeli army's aggression. This led the SDS to create an interesting connection between supporting Third World liberation efforts, including solidarity with Palestine, and challenging police violence and other forms of state repression within what was then West Germany. That a student could be killed for participating in peaceful protests provided clear evidence that West Germany had not overcome the dangers of fascism." So this is in West Germany, right before the 1967 Israeli war, which I believe is called the Six-Day War.
Yes.
And this is West Germany, which is supposed to be the democratic state, the democratic side of the wall after it was split following the atrocities that the Third Reich committed. But we see the response to citizens, to everyday people stepping outside the demands that the state has for us.
That's right.
In West Germany in the 60s was similar to the way that the U.S. responded in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, 90s, aughts, teens, and 20s. The so-called freedoms we have in the West are fragile at best and non-existent when the state decides they are.
Wow.
Right. We can just send in the cops to take care of protesters however we want. And what's the immunity that police have in the United States? Like, well, I felt threatened. So
yeah. Oh man, you're right. When the state has had enough, then that's it.
Yes.
Fragile.
So,
wow.
Yeah. Fragile at best. Non-existent when they decide it is.
That's right.
But this article also lays out how organizers saw the ways that resisting state repression, that when we see how state repression operates, we see how our liberation is tied up with one another.
Yes.
And so they saw that as a way to support Third World liberation efforts that were happening across the world at that time as colonies were freeing themselves from mostly England, but also France and some other country, Portugal. But this vision of solidarity reminds us that any work that we're doing toward liberation is both for us as individuals, as for us as citizens, as well as for the collective, for the globe, for people in general. So we can't have one without the other. None of us are free until all of us are free. And I think that's the piece in this story, this piece of history she includes here that I really appreciated and resonated with, particularly in the context of seeing state violence, state repression against protesters on college campuses across the country right now.
Yes, I think you're right. I think that's brilliant analysis. So I also appreciated her story about what was taking place in West Germany in the 60s. And what you said there at the end really struck me, that this vision of solidarity. And that only sticks out to me because I just started reading what will be our May book.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. It's called Solidarity. It's by Leah Hunt Hendricks and Asher Taylor. And we got to see them talk about the book live. But Aaron is holding up the book and flipping the pages, as you can hear. A little ASMR action happening there.
There you go.
But I just started reading it, and I only got through the introduction and part of the first chapter, but they lay out why solidarity is so important and why they wrote this book and trying to make the case for all of us to get on board with this idea of solidarity. And I'm so jazzed to read that book. But yeah, you're right. This work is so important. So I love that. Thanks for bringing that to the table. One of the things that continues to boggle my mind when I think about this genocide in general, but Angela Davis really made me sit with it and wrestle with it a little bit, is, this genocide is such an atrocity and it's so heartbreaking. And I feel like those aren't even strong enough words to describe it. But it's not just the fact that the tragic loss of life and the number of lives that have been lost, that's one thing, which is awful in and of itself. But it's also the compounding impact that this will be and how it will be felt by Palestinians for generations to come. So Dr. Davis says this in the piece, quote, Israel's genocidal war against the Palestinian people in Gaza has produced unimaginable grief and sorrow. Gazan families will never fully recover from the deaths of their loved ones, from the destruction of their homes. As many as 70% of homes and more than half of all buildings have been damaged or destroyed. From their months-long attempts to survive without food or water, or from sleeping in the open as human counterparts of the scarred landscape, which may not recover in the foreseeable future. The vicious and dehumanizing verbal assaults by representatives of the government and armed forces have compounded this trauma. In announcing a complete siege of Gaza, the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant announced, quote, there will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed. He justified this action by adding, quote, we are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly. The international press widely quoted these remarks in the aftermath of the October 7th assault by Hamas. When I was sitting with this and grappling with it, I recognize that I'm a feeler and not everyone is, but I cannot fathom how the number of people who have been murdered in this genocide, combined with the impact that this ongoing atrocity will have for years to come, and combine that with the pure hatred and vitriol for the Palestinian people that we've seen on full display everywhere we look, doesn't add up to something that we collectively, can be opposed to,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember when that quote from Yoav Gallant was going around after he said it. And I remember being horrified then.
Yeah.
I think now it's beyond that. It cuts to the bone. It's bone chilling.
Yes.
Because, and this is just one example of this kind of talk from Israeli government officials. It's chilling because they've been doing exactly what they told everybody they were going to do.
That's true.
And that's why people started protesting against these decisions and actions and statements almost immediately in early October, because so many people knew this is where we were headed.
Yes.
This is what the IDF wanted, because they basically told us this is what they would do.
They laid it out.
And it's all of the lives that you talked about. It's also the scarred landscape. We mentioned briefly the way that the ecocide is also being committed to make the land uninhabitable, unlivable, infertile, I guess, to being unable to produce anything or have anything there. And it's just
now and for
a long time,
future. For the foreseeable future, absolutely.
And so many people don't have homes. So many people have been pushed out of their homes and they're refugees with nowhere to go. And there's also, he talks about there's no electricity, no food, no fuel, there's no medicine, there's none of that stuff. It's a huge atrocity. It's a huge crisis. And so many people have died, and so many more people, I think, are on the brink of dying.
Yes.
And and we're supposed to believe that this is a just action and this is allegedly defense.
Right.
And they've been telling us the whole time that this is what they
not
wanted to do.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that quote, that whole thing, that whole segment of the article just, cut me to the core.
Yeah, you said bone chilling, and I think that's a great way to describe it.
Hey there, folks. Sorry for the interruption, but we wanted to invite you to join us over on Patreon.
Yeah, we're so excited to be on Patreon and be able to create some additional content and opportunities for us to learn and unlearn together.
That's right. We'll be rolling out some new ways you can join us in our collective learning and unlearning over the next few weeks.
So you can join for free and get some regular updates from us. And we'll also have paid tiers available as well with extra content available each month.
You can find us at patreon.com/interdependent study and join us today.
That's right. You can join right now at patreon.com/interdependent study. Okay, now back to the episode.
Patreon.com/interdependent study.
Well, okay, let's shift this episode into application. And as difficult as it is to say this with this kind of content, this is my favorite part of our show. How does this piece and our conversation about it apply to our everyday lives and our work? For me, the application of this is that what has taken place in Palestine and whatever continues to happen in Palestine will undoubtedly have a tremendous impact on our shared and our collective humanity. Period. Full stop. I saw this news story last week, I think it was last week, about how the country of Colombia decided to suspend its diplomatic relations with Israel because of its role in the genocide in Gaza, which is huge given that Israel was a longtime defense ally of Colombia. But one of the things that their president, Gustavo Petro, said about his country's decision to do this was, quote, "If Palestine dies, humanity dies." And I don't think there's a more perfect way to sum up why the situation is as dire as it is and is as important as it is. And one of the things that Angela Davis said in this piece, that the loss of life and destruction we've seen here is unprecedented in comparison to all of our recent wars. Yeah. And I don't know, I think if we just can't afford any more of it. If not for anything else, I think just for the sheer destruction of our humanity. And so, yeah, the President Petro, that quote, "If Palestine dies, humanity dies," to me, that's the application from this.
Yeah, I think it's moving.
Yeah.
It's poignant. It's to the point, and it gets right at the heart of
it communicates it
where we need
clearly
to be.
to me.
Yeah. My application is to take a page out of Dr. Davis's book, so to speak.
Okay.
Not literally taking a page, but to recognize how our individual freedoms are tied up in the freedom of everybody. Just kind of continuing that theme. I know I talked about this already, but one of the main points that I get from this article she wrote is how interconnected we all are as people and how interconnected the systems are to us as people and to each other.
Yes.
So the system of imperialism of the United States is connected deeply to global white supremacy and capitalism and patriarchy and more. And we can see this in the ways that U.S. taxpayers are funding so much of the weapons that are being used in Gaza, or that the U.S. arms manufacturers are selling their weapons to the IDF and using those in Gaza. We see it in the way that our institutions inside of the empire respond when we demand that they change their ways and divest from these death cults. I've definitely said this before, but there are so many ways to participate in freedom movements. We don't all have to be intense in encampments, but we all can find a way to plug in.
Yes.
So find some place to send a few dollars to, or, vote uncommitted in your primary if it hasn't happened yet. Tell your officials how implicated we all are in Israel's war crimes and how this influences what actions you're taking for this election cycle.
Yes.
And all of that are reasons to take action, but also the reasons to take action are that this isn't what should be happening in the world.
Absolutely not.
That's where I think I start from. That's the feeling part of it. And then as I think about it, I'm like, yeah, and all of these things too.
Right.
We're all implicated because the arms of U.S. imperialism, or the fingerprints of U.S. imperialism, are all over this.
Yes.
And that matters too, And I think that speaks more to the people who are continuing to make these decisions than saying this isn't what should be happening.
Absolutely.
So that's my application. We're not free until everybody is free, and we have to find ways to plug into the movements to start to make a change, start to make a shift, start to create the new worlds we deserve.
Absolutely. Well, and I love that, and I love the reminder of that. So thank you for saying this, but not everyone has to be in the tents and the encampments. That isn't comfortable. That isn't a way in for a lot of people. And I totally understand that, but how else can you plug in? How else can you support this movement work? There are individual actions that all of us can take to make our voices heard and to be a part of this. And so, I appreciate that reminder.
Even if it's just continuing to learn for yourself and try to understand what's happening or
the history and the context
history of it.
Right.
To be able to understand enough to share with family members or friends or other people who might also be confused, because for so long, what we've been told is that it's a complicated issue. And I think, for me at least, it's becoming a lot less complicated as I learn more about things.
Yes. And if you're not in the place where Aaron's at, for me, it's this idea that I can't sit and watch these deaths, right?
Yeah, we can't.
There are no schools in Gaza. I mean, that alone for me is enough.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, let's talk about homework. How are we going to continue our learning once we leave this here table of ours? My idea for homework is completely born out of curiosity, to be honest. So you referenced this a little bit, but in this piece, Dr. Davis mentions her experience in Germany, but specifically returning back to the United States from Germany in the late 1960s and finding her way to and getting involved in the Black liberation movement happening here. And how the organizations she became involved in, like the Communist Party, the Black Panther Party, and the LA chapter of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, were all really clear about their solidarity with Palestine. And so I just want to kind of go back and do some digging to see what kinds of public statements those organizations made about their solidarity, what kinds of organizing work they were engaged in. I don't know. There's part of me that just kind of thinks it'd be cool to check out and to learn from and to see, and because that's just work that they were doing that I'm just not as familiar with as some of the other work that those organizations were engaged in. So what about you?
Yeah, well, I love that. My homework is to read some more Angela Davis.
Yes.
I read her book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, a while ago now. So it'd be nice to go and revisit that. There's some stuff in there about Palestine. We've read a co-authored book she wrote here on the podcast, Abolition Feminisms Now. I read Are Prisons Obsolete?
Yeah.
And I think something else by her too a while ago. And I have my autobiography up on my shelf.
Not your autobiography, her autobiography.
Yeah, her. Did I say mine?
You said mine.
I didn't. Yeah, I haven't written one of those.
Yeah.
Maybe one day, probably not. I have her autobiography up on my shelf that was revised and updated a couple years ago in a new edition. So I'd like to get to that. And then her latest book is titled Abolition. Very simply, to the point. And I believe we want to bring that to the table here in the next few months.
Sure
so
do.
there you go. That's two books that we have brought, we've forecasted and shared. We're talking about Solidarity by Asher Taylor and Leah Hunt Hendricks. And we're talking about Abolition by Angela Davis at some point. Solidarity is next. I don't know when Abolition is, but
I've started to read it, so it's definitely next.
Yeah.
That's great. I mean, I love that homework. Any opportunity to read more Angela Davis, cosign. Very good. All right, well, folks, that's what we've got for this week's episode. And Aaron is up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I'm bringing a couple of things about the war in Sudan.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Which we haven't been able to talk about much here on the podcast.
Yeah.
And I haven't taken much time yet to learn about beyond a few things on social media I've seen that have shown up on my feed, whether videos or posts or whatnot. So I'm bringing an article from NPR called Sudan's Conflict Hits the 1-Year Mark, Sparking Fears of Repeated Atrocities, written by Kate Bartlett. And that came out last month in April. And an episode of The Listening Post, which is a show on Al Jazeera. This particular episode is called Sudan, A Savage War and Toxic Information Battle.
Wow.
So yeah, that's what I'm bringing, just a little bit of, I guess, an introduction into what's been going on there.
Yes.
As a way to, I think, expand our consciousness of what's happening in the world. Because a lot of times we're focused on stuff in the States.
Yes.
And I think it's just good to expand our horizons and understand what's happening beyond sort of the more local things that we talk about frequently, because, as we said, it's all interconnected. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm excited about this only because I'm with you. I haven't really been able to dive too much into this. And I don't even know if this is strong enough of a word, the humanitarian crisis that's taking place in Sudan. And so I'm excited to check out those two pieces and to learn more. And I like how you describe it as an introduction to maybe what's going on for us. So thanks for bringing that to the table next time.
Of course.
Very good. All right, folks. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what we want you to do, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on the socials, including Instagram and TikTok. Check us out over on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. We'll talk to you next week.